From bodyguards to butchers, the twisted evolution of the SS. The SS began as a small personal guard for Hitler in 1925, a unit meant to protect the Führer and enforce his authority. Over the next 2 decades, it grew into a sprawling, ruthless organization that touched every part of Nazi Germany's power structure. By the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the SS had splintered into multiple branches. The Allgemeine SS handled police work, ideology, and administration, keeping the internal machinery of the Nazi state running smoothly. The Waffen-SS became a combat force, fighting on every front from France to the Eastern Front, often with brutality that rivaled or exceeded the regular army. The Totenkopfverbände, or Death's Head units, were the ones stationed at concentration and extermination camps, overseeing forced labor, deportations, and mass murder. Membership in the SS was no casual choice. Young men were recruited from Hitler Youth or indoctrinated in schools, taught to place loyalty to Hitler above family, conscience, or country. Authority flowed from officers down to the youngest recruits, creating a rigid hierarchy where obedience was demanded and questioning orders was unthinkable. Life inside the SS was harsh, disciplined, and violent. Daily routines combined ideological drills with brutal enforcement of Nazi policies. In camps like Auschwitz, Dachau, and Stutthof, guards oversaw prisoners forced to labor under extreme conditions. Death marches became a grim routine in the final months of the war, where hundreds of thousands were forced to walk for miles with little food or water, and anyone who faltered was shot. Officers coordinated executions, shootings, and deportations with bureaucratic precision, recording transports, deaths, and prisoner movements in meticulous logs. Einsatzgruppen units in Eastern Europe carried out mass shootings, with officers like Bruno Stereenbach organizing logistics to ensure efficiency in killing tens of thousands of civilians. Indoctrination and fear combined to create men capable of unimaginable acts, often without hesitation or visible remorse. Violence became normalized, and for many SS men, it was as routine as any other duty. The Great Escape, the SS's desperate flight from justice. By 1945, the machinery of the SS began to collapse under the weight of Allied and Soviet advances. Cities were destroyed, communications broke down, and orders from Berlin were sporadic and confusing. Himmler's last desperate commands sent prisoners on death marches to silence potential witnesses, while some SS men abandoned posts altogether. High-ranking leaders faced swift justice or chose suicide. Himmler killed himself in May. Other officers were executed by the Soviets or captured by Allied forces. Lower-ranking men were left with uncertainty and fear, knowing that survival now depended on evasion rather than orders. The world they had helped shape was crumbling around them, leaving chaos in every corner. Many SS members vanished into that chaos. Some hid in villages or blended into cities, taking on mundane professions as bakers, salesmen, or mechanics. Others altered their identities, covering tattoos, forging documents, or moving to distant countries like Argentina, Syria, or the United States. Networks like Stille Hilfe provided money, shelter, and legal support, helping former SS men slip away from justice. For decades, some lived ordinary lives unnoticed, while others remained hunted, constantly fearing exposure and arrest. As the SS dissolved, some disappeared into ordinary life, others fled across continents, but all carried the weight of their crimes into a world that had begun to move on, unaware that the shadows of the past had never truly left. The SSs' Second Lives. Bruno Day, the Stutthof guard who became a baker. Bruno Day spent decades in quiet anonymity, living in a small northern German village where he worked as a baker. Neighbors remembered him simply as a polite, gentle man, someone who greeted everyone with a smile and helped out whenever he could. Few would have guessed that the elderly man kneading dough and delivering bread had once been a young SS guard at Stutthof, part of a brutal system that oversaw the imprisonment and death of thousands. Born in Hamburg in 1924, Day was just 17 when he was drafted into the Waffen-SS in 1941. Like many teenagers of his generation, he was swept up by the war, indoctrinated with ideology, and sent to serve in one of the darkest chapters of Nazi history. In 1944, he was assigned to Stutthof, a camp notorious for its harsh conditions and constant cruelty. At Stutthof, Day's duties were grim and unforgiving. He stood guard over prisoners, ensuring they obeyed orders and marched as commanded. During the death marches of 1945, he and other guards forced prisoners to walk through snow and mud for miles, punishing anyone who faltered. Survivors later recounted the sound of whips cracking, the harsh shouts of the guards, and the cold indifference of men who had been ordinary boys only a few years earlier. Day's role was small in the machinery of the Holocaust, yet it was lethal. By preventing escapes and enforcing marches, he contributed directly to the suffering and deaths of countless people. After the war, Day returned to civilian life and settled in Hamburg, later moving to a quiet village where he could blend into ordinary society. For decades, he remained unnoticed, raising a family and running a bakery, living as if the horrors of the past belonged to someone else. But in 2011, at the age of 93, German authorities exposed him as a former SS guard. The news shocked his neighbors and brought media attention that he could not escape. Health concerns delayed his trial, but the world now saw the man who had lived for decades under a veil of ordinary life. He said little, refusing to speak publicly about his time at Stutthof, maintaining a careful silence that had protected him for most of his life. While Day remained rooted in Germany, living out his final years quietly in the village, other SS men took different paths, fleeing far beyond Germany to hide their pasts across continents, escaping into anonymity. Hans Lipshis, the Auschwitz salesman. Hans Lipshis lived a life of stark contrasts, one that concealed horror behind decades of mundane routine. Born in Lithuania in 1923, he joined the Waffen-SS at 18, swept into the tides of war and Nazi indoctrination. By 1943, he was stationed at Auschwitz, one of the most infamous death camps of the Holocaust. There, Lipshis became part of the system that carried out the murder of tens of thousands of people. He was tasked with guarding prisoners, overseeing deportations, and ensuring that the machinery of killing ran smoothly. After the war, Lipshis vanished into anonymity. In 1951, he emigrated to Chicago, entering the United States under a false identity. He became a salesman, working quietly in stores, blending into ordinary neighborhoods filled with immigrants and working families. For decades, his life seemed ordinary. Neighbors described him as polite and meticulous, with small habits that hinted at obsessive control. He polished his shoes carefully, cleaned his apartment repeatedly, and appeared almost anxious about keeping the smallest details perfect. These trivial routines formed a sharp contrast with the atrocities he had once witnessed and participated in. For decades, Lipshis lived among ordinary people who never suspected the darkness of his past, moving freely through the streets, shopping, and working without ever being challenged or questioned. In the early 2000s, decades after the war, his past came under scrutiny. Authorities investigating former SS members identified him as a former Auschwitz guard. German prosecutors charged him with complicity in the murder of thousands of people. By that time, he was elderly and frail, and legal proceedings faced complications. Diagnosed with dementia, he was deemed unfit to stand trial and was released from custody. He spent his remaining years quietly in Chicago, largely shielded from media attention, living the life of a man who had been both a witness and participant in historical atrocities, yet never held fully accountable. Hans Lipshis died on June 16, 2016, at the age of 92. His death closed the chapter on a life that straddled ordinary civility and unspeakable crime. It showed how some former SS members could vanish into civilian life, their pasts hidden in plain sight for decades. While some who fled the continent did so to vanish, others remained under surveillance but reintegrated into public service. Bruno Stereenbach, the bureaucrat in the shadows. Bruno Stereenbach operated in the cold heart of the Nazi killing machine, far from the chaos of the camps, but no less deadly. From his office, he oversaw deportations from Poland, sending trainloads of Jews, Romani, and others to death camps. He coordinated mass executions, signed orders for death squads, and monitored the machinery of murder with meticulous precision. Survivor testimonies and archival documents describe him as methodical and unemotional, taking pride in how efficiently people could be killed. His correspondence shows a chilling preoccupation with timetables, noting the punctuality of deportations and executions as if they were simple administrative tasks rather than human lives. Born in 1892, Stereenbach had been a career SS man long before the Holocaust. He rose through the ranks with a reputation for loyalty and obedience. Personal letters reveal a man who believed in the system he served, boasting of the efficiency with which operations were carried out. He rarely appeared on the front lines, rarely confronted prisoners face to face, but the effects of his work were lethal. By ensuring trains ran on schedule, orders were executed, and reports were filed, he indirectly signed the death warrants of thousands. Colleagues remembered him as distant, meticulous, and often obsessed with details that most would have considered trivial, down to the timing of executions and the accuracy of paperwork. After the war, Stereenbach avoided prosecution. Unlike other SS, he was never tried. He lived in West Germany, quietly taking minor administrative jobs while being monitored by Allied authorities. He avoided public attention entirely, and the decades allowed him to fade into obscurity. Intelligence reports indicated that he remained a figure of interest, but there was never enough public or legal momentum to bring him to court. Letters and documents released later revealed that he never expressed remorse. He remained a bureaucrat proud of his work, viewing it through the lens of duty rather than morality. Stereenbach's life illustrates how the machinery of murder extended beyond the camps themselves. Not every perpetrator wielded a weapon. Some signed papers, coordinated schedules, and ensured the trains ran on time. Linus, the Estonian camp commander. Linus ruled Vaivara concentration camp like a shadow over the prisoners, his authority absolute and brutal. From 1943 until the camp's liberation in September 1944, he oversaw forced labor, daily beatings, starvation, and executions. Survivors recalled him walking among the barracks, whip in hand, overseeing punishment for the slightest infractions. Public hangings and summary executions were part of his routine, carried out in front of prisoners to instill fear. Prisoners were forced to work in freezing conditions on railway and oil shale projects, often collapsing from exhaustion while guards like Linus looked on. Letters and testimonies show his obsession with order and discipline, treating the suffering of inmates as a matter of bureaucratic efficiency rather than human life. Vaivara may have been a smaller camp compared to Auschwitz or Stutthof, but under Linus, it became a microcosm of the Nazi system of terror. Born in 1919 in Võru County, Estonia, Linus grew up under successive occupations and social upheaval. When German forces invaded Estonia in 1941, he joined the SS, quickly earning a reputation for ruthlessness. His promotions came as a result of his willingness to enforce harsh measures without hesitation. Prisoners remembered his inspections of work details, the way he rewarded obedience with minor reprieves, and punished even minor disobedience with beatings. Survival depended on navigating his rigid, violent routines, and many historians note that his cruelty was both methodical and personal, reflecting a deep indoctrination in the ideology of the SS. After the war, Linus escaped capture by the advancing Soviet forces and managed to emigrate to the United States in the 1950s. He settled in New York, working first as a janitor and later as a mechanic, living quietly, while his past remained hidden from neighbors and colleagues. It wasn't until the 1980s that US authorities, following decades of investigations into Nazi war criminals, discovered his identity. In 1986, his US citizenship was revoked, and in 1987 he was deported to the Soviet Union to face charges of war crimes. He was imprisoned in Leningrad. Official records show he died in 1982 in Soviet custody, leaving behind survivors' testimonies and camp documents as the only record of his brutality. Linus's life illustrates the divergent fates of former SS men. Some were eventually caught and imprisoned decades later, forced to answer for crimes, while others returned quietly to civilian life, blending in and avoiding scrutiny. Walter Reer, the Austrian mass murderer. Walter Reer's death in 1991 in Austria marked the end of one of the darkest living links to Nazi atrocities in Italy, a moment that drew renewed attention to the scale of wartime violence, even decades after the events. For survivors of the Marzabotto massacre, Reer's passing was both a relief and a bitter reminder that justice had arrived late. He had spent decades in obscurity after his release in 1985, blending into ordinary life in Klagenfurt, a stark contrast to the streets of northern Italy where he had orchestrated mass killings. Born in 1915 in Klagenfurt, Austria, Reer joined the SS as a young man and rose to command units deployed in Italy during 1944. That year, his troops carried out the Marzabotto massacre, killing over 700 civilians in villages like Marzabotto, Monzuno, and others in the Apennine Hills. Survivors recalled him walking calmly through smoke-filled streets, inspecting the killings as homes burned and bodies lay strewn in the rubble. Women, children, and men were executed without mercy, often after being dragged from hiding or rounded up as part of reprisal actions for partisan attacks. Soldiers later testified that Reer treated the operation as a military exercise, checking that killings and arson proceeded on schedule, measuring efficiency over humanity. After the war, Reer was captured and extradited to Italy, facing trial in Bologna in 1951. Witnesses gave vivid accounts of the horrors, including the methodical execution of families, the destruction of villages, and the terror that blanketed the region. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, reflecting the severity of his crimes. For decades, he served under strict conditions, a rare case in post-war justice where a single SS officer was punished for mass killings in occupied Italy. Reer was released in 1985, returning to Austria and living quietly until his death in 1991. The long gap between his crimes and his final years highlighted how many perpetrators were able to evade accountability for decades, sometimes returning home under ordinary appearances while survivors carried the trauma. Walter Reer wasn't the only one to remain in Europe. Others survived too, but this man managed to live quietly under a new identity. Erich Pribka, the Rome massacre perpetrator. After the war ended in 1945, Erich Pribka disappeared from Europe, taking advantage of the chaos that engulfed Germany and Italy. He used the network of escape routes later called the rat lines to slip out of the continent and eventually reached Argentina. In Bariloche, a remote town in the Andes that had become a refuge for former Nazis, he assumed a false identity and began a new life. There, he married, ran a small business, and mingled with the local community, living openly yet quietly. For decades, He moved through this quiet life almost invisibly, while the shadow of his crimes hung over Europe, particularly Rome, where the massacre he orchestrated would not be forgotten. The brutality he had enacted in Italy was chillingly methodical. On March 24, 1944, Pribka oversaw the execution of 335 civilians in the Ardeatine caves as a reprisal for a partisan attack that killed 33 German soldiers. Men, women, and teenagers were lined up, shot, and left in the caves. Pribka maintained meticulous records of each victim, tracking every name with an almost obsessive attention to detail. Witnesses later recalled how he approached the massacre with cold precision, treating mass murder almost like an administrative task, ensuring every detail was documented and accounted for. Pribka's background shaped the man he became. Born in Hennigsdorf, Germany, in 1913, he had joined the SS as a young adult and was deployed to Italy, where he climbed the ranks and became intimately involved in the German occupation. His role placed him in direct command over civilians and prisoners, giving him the authority to carry out executions with bureaucratic efficiency. Unlike some of his peers, Pribka took pride in the record-keeping itself, seeing the documentation as a measure of control and order, even in acts of extreme violence. His triviality in the face of murder was part of what made him so notorious. He seemed almost fascinated by the administrative side of killing, cataloging the massacre with such care that the lists of names later helped identify victims and tie him to the crimes decades later. That same detachment allowed him to live in Argentina for nearly 50 years, blending into society as a normal man, while his victims' families and historians documented the horror he had wrought. Everything changed in 1994 when investigative journalists exposed his identity. Italy requested his extradition, and after months of legal wrangling, Pribka was returned to Rome. He was placed under house arrest rather than traditional imprisonment due to his age, living in a villa under constant supervision. There he remained until his death in 2013, closing the final chapter on a life that had spanned continents, evaded justice for decades, and left behind a chilling record of calculated cruelty. Friedrich Angel, the Butcher of Genoa. Friedrich Angel's name is forever stained by the blood of 59 Italian prisoners executed on May 19, 1944, at the Turchino Pass in northern Italy. This brutal act was a direct response to a partisan attack on a German soldiers' cinema in Genoa, which resulted in the deaths of 5 German sailors. Angel, as head of the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, in Genoa, orchestrated this massacre, selecting prisoners from Marassi prison and overseeing their execution. The victims, mostly young men, were chained together and forced to stand on planks over a mass grave, where they were shot by firing squads. Those who survived the initial volley were executed with a bullet to the head, reportedly by Angel himself. The bodies were left in the pit, and families were not informed of their loved ones' fates until after the war. Born on January 3, 1909, in Warnau, Germany, Angel joined the SS in 1936 and quickly rose through the ranks. He served in various locations, including Oslo, before being appointed head of the SD in Genoa in January 1944. His tenure was marked by a series of brutal reprisals against civilians and partisans. Angel's role in these atrocities was not limited to the Turchino Pass massacre. He also ordered the execution of 147 partisans at Benedicta in April 1944 and oversaw the deportation of Italian Jews to concentration camps. After the war, Angel managed to evade justice for decades. He lived under various aliases in Germany, blending into society while the families of his victims mourned in silence. It wasn't until 1989 that an Italian military court convicted him in absentia for his role in the massacres, sentencing him to life imprisonment. However, Germany refused to extradite him. In 2002, a German court convicted Engel of 59 counts of murder and sentenced him to 7 years in prison, but due to his advanced age, the sentence was suspended. The case was later overturned on appeal in 2004, with the court citing insufficient evidence to prove the murders were committed with the requisite level of cruelty. Engel died on February 4, 2006 in Hamburg, Germany, at the age of 97, without ever serving a day in prison for his crimes. Karl Mookel, the accountant who disappeared. From the outside, there was nothing wrong with Karl Mookel. In the 1950s and 60s, he lived quietly in West Germany as a businessman, going about his daily routine without raising suspicion. His neighbors would have seen a respectable man in a suit, a family man, perhaps even a diligent worker, entirely unaware of the horrors he had been part of during the war. His family knew nothing of his past, and in their eyes, he was just another man rebuilding his life in the wake of Germany's defeat. But behind the calmness hidden a past that was far darker than anyone around him could imagine. Born on January 9, 1901 in Klingenthal, Germany, Mookel trained as an accountant. He joined the Nazi Party in 1926 and became a member of the SS soon after, rising through the ranks because of his reliability and organizational skill. By the early 1940s, he was working in administrative offices connected to the SS Wirtschaftsverwaltungshauptamt, WWII, the main office responsible for the economic and administrative operations of the SS. His skills with numbers and paperwork eventually brought him to Auschwitz in the spring of 1943, where he assumed the position of head of the camp's administrative office. At Auschwitz, Mookel's work was chillingly methodical. He oversaw the logistics of deportations, making sure trains carrying Jews and other prisoners ran on time to the gas chambers. He ensured that the processing of prisoners' belongings, everything from clothing to valuables, was orderly and fully documented. Reports from survivors and records indicate that he would personally correct clerks' errors on deportation lists, a small but terrifying example of how administrative carelessness could result in death, and how Mookel enforced deadly precision. His role may have seemed purely bureaucratic, but without the system he maintained, the machinery of Auschwitz could not have functioned with such lethal efficiency. After the war, Mookel avoided prosecution and faded into anonymity. Unlike other SS officers who were hunted or tried, he managed to live decades quietly under his own identity, moving through West German society without drawing attention. His involvement in the mechanics of mass murder remained hidden from the public eye, and he died in the 1970s without ever facing legal scrutiny for his crimes. Michael Ciphert, the quiet Canadian man. Michael Ciphert appeared to be just another retiree in Vancouver. A quiet man, he lived in a modest home, kept to himself, and worked as a lumber mill laborer. His neighbors knew him simply as Misha, unaware of the dark past he had concealed for decades. Born on March 16, 1924, in Landau, now part of Mykolaiv Oblast, Ukraine, Ciphert's early life was marked by the turmoil of war-torn Eastern Europe. In 1951, Ciphert immigrated to Canada, claiming to be born in Estonia and omitting his service as an SS guard during World War II. This deception allowed him to gain Canadian citizenship, despite policies that would have barred his entry had his true identity been known. For years, he lived under the radar, blending into the Canadian landscape. However, in 1995, historian Carla Giacomozzi began researching the Bolzano transit camp in northern Italy, where Ciphert had served as a guard from December 1944 to April 1945. Through interviews with survivors and archival research, she uncovered testimonies of brutal acts committed by two Ukrainian guards, known as Misha and Otto. Further investigation revealed that Ciphert was Misha, the notorious figure responsible for numerous atrocities. In 2000, an Italian military tribunal convicted Ciphert in absentia of 9 murders committed at the Bolzano camp. The charges included the rape and murder of a pregnant woman, the gouging out of a prisoner's eyes, and the deliberate starvation of a young boy. The tribunal sentenced him to life imprisonment. Canadian authorities initiated proceedings to revoke Ciphert's citizenship, arguing that he had obtained it through misrepresentation. In 2008, after exhausting all legal avenues, Ciphert was extradited to Italy at the age of 83. He was incarcerated in the Santa Maria Capua Veterere military prison, where prosecutors from Italy and Germany intended to interview him regarding other potential war crimes at Bolzano. On October 25, 2010, Ciphert fell in his cell, resulting in a broken femur. He was transferred to a hospital, but died on November 6, 2010, from complications related to his injuries and gastric issues. His body remained unclaimed and was buried in a cemetery near Caserta. Ciphert's life shows how some who participated in the Holocaust could vanish into ordinary society, carrying their crimes in silence. Even decades later, the world had to chase them down, a reminder that the past never fully disappears, and justice can be long, slow, and incomplete.